Man, when you look at what happened behind the scenes with Dragon Age the Veilguard, you realize that it's a miracle that it came out in a functional, polished state at all. The qualms that people had with Dragon Age had a lot to do with the direction that it went in, the tonal dissonance, the writing, various aspects that a lot of people felt this Dragon Age entry really just didn't quite feel like Dragon Age. And there's a good reason for why it all ended up being so disjointed. We talked previously, many years back about the reboots that Dragon Age underwent because EA mandated that this entry would be a live service before they reverted that decision when Anthem ended up flopping utterly and completely. And it was that decision that kind of trickled down to the rest of the development of this game and why it ended up the way it was, in a way that just really didn't appeal to a whole lot of people, fans and casuals alike. And so right here we have a report from news outlet Bloomberg. Jason Schreier decided to investigate what the heck went wrong with Dragon Age the Veilguard. And suddenly, going through this report, everything makes so much more sense. Now, you may recall that Dragon Age the Veilguard did not sell particularly well. EA posted in this press release that Dragon Age engaged approximately 1.5 million players during the quarter, down nearly 50% from the company's expectations. And it's not that it sold 1.5 million copies, it's that 1.5 million players engaged with it. There was a free trial for the game that players could engage in. Doesn't necessarily mean that they stuck with it and bought the game. So 1.5 million players engaged, and what EA was expecting was 3 million players engaging with the title. So that goes to highlight just how utterly and completely the game failed to gain traction. And looking at this article where Jason Schreier spoke to 24 people who worked on Dragon Age the Veilguard, suddenly how this project could turn out the way it did makes so much sense. Bioware was riding on a high when Dragon Age Inquisition came out back in 2014. It won Game of the Year, went on to sell 12 million copies, and so it didn't take long before EA and the folks at Bioware were like, let's talk about the next entry. And so Mark Dara and Mike Laidlaw kind of decided to lay the groundworks for a new Dragon Age installment that was codenamed Joplin. But then they needed all hands on deck for Mass Effect Andromeda, as well as Anthem. Both of those games flopped. They financially were not beneficial to EA. They did not sell what they needed to sell, and Anthem in particular was just a complete disaster. Now, during the development of Anthem, with EA being on this, we need to pursue live services high, Mike Laidlaw, the creative director of Dragon Age, was told by higher-ups that he needed to make the new Dragon Age game, the Dragon Age sequel, a live service. This happened in October of 2017, and Mike Laidlaw was very upset. Apparently, there's an anecdote about how he brought his team into a room where he was drinking basically into a stupor, and he kind of relayed that the game would be shifting into a live service, which he knew was just wrong. And so the end result was that Mike Laidlaw, a big part of what made Dragon Age so special, his vision, he decided to resign from EA because he was having none of this. And so much of this game's woes started there. That's what caused the disjointed direction, the tonal dissonance, the writing being what it is. It all stemmed from EA's mandate. In fact, there's a video out there from Mark Dara, who no longer works at Bioware and who has been a lot more transparent about his experiences behind the scenes with Bioware now that he's not as under NDA as he was when he was working for EA. He went on a YouTube video to talk about how when EA said, make this a live service, that's the pivot that caused the downfall of this title. And he full on says that he wishes that pivot had never occurred, because that truly was the pivotal moment where EA straight up doomed this project. The thing is that in 2020, when they finally decided to revert the decision of turning the next Dragon Age entry into a live service, by then, a lot of the foundation of the multiplayer version of Dragon Age had already been established, and because of the strict deadline that they had to ship the next Dragon Age entry, they couldn't just start from scratch. They had to use a lot of what they had already made, the foundation that they had already established, which was for a multiplayer Dragon Age game, and so they had to just kind of work with that as a foundation and build from that. So one of the ways in which this live service mandate trickled down was in the way it established the more lighthearted tone of Dragon Age the Veilguard. Because they were going for an online game, the new director for the game, who replaced Mike Laidlaw, former art director Matt Goldman, he felt like for an online game, he needed to kind of make the tone more pulpy, more lighthearted, and not stick to kind of the more dark fantasy kind of tone and atmosphere that older Dragon Age games went with. When you make something a live service, an online game, it's about trying to make it as mass appeal as possible, and he felt like a lighter tone would accomplish EA's goal of making this a highly successful live service that brings in tons of players. When you try to make something that appeals to everyone, you ultimately end up appealing to no one. What you end up doing when you try to appeal to everyone is you dilute a creative vision, and so you get something that ultimately feels very generic and not in line with the expectations of what a franchise should be and what makes that franchise special. And so with that tone shift, because of the multiplayer live service component being forced by EA, you already got the tone there that got lost, that Dragon Age fans loved from especially Dragon Age Origins. And then this live service mandate also informed a lot of the design choices of the gameplay of Dragon Age the Veilguard, like how instead of featuring the full tactical combat from the older games, this was more kind of very action heavy. And then because Dragon Age the Veilguard was once meant to be an online live service game, when it comes to those choices that lead to narrative consequences, that stuff couldn't be implemented in the way you can with single-player experiences, which is why the final game, Dragon Age the Veilguard, those impactful player decisions that lead to narrative developments, that wasn't there nearly as impactfully and as strongly as it was in past Dragon Age games and past Bioware games just across the board. Those big moments in Bioware games like characters dying or certain choices having tremendous consequences that couldn't be implemented into the multiplayer version of Dragon Age, that had to persist because the foundation was already there for what was originally supposed to be a multiplayer live service experience. And so they couldn't just shift all of that into what they could have accomplished if this had started out as a strictly single player RPG project. It's why mission design in Dragon Age the Veilguard suffered, and it felt like it kind of could belong in one of those multiplayer games where missions are meant to be repeated over and over and over again. It diluted the kinds of missions you could create. You have much more liberty with single player experiences. The thing is, the Bioware team was given no time to do a full reset on this project so they could make the game that they truly wanted to make from scratch without all of this multiplayer Dragon Age stuff kind of bogging them down. They had to work from that. As Bloomberg put it here, typically this kind of pivot will be coupled with a reset and a period of pre-production, allowing the designers to formulate a new vision for the game, which is what this single player Dragon Age needed, because it's a completely different game from what it was originally supposed to be. But instead, the team was asked to change the game's fundamental structure and recast the entire story on the fly. According to people familiar with the new marching orders, they were given a year and a half to finish and told to aim for as wide a market as possible. So how little time they had to completely pivot the direction of this Dragon Age game, once a live service, now a single player game, meant that they just had to work with what they'd already built, which means a lot of the live service Dragon Age stuff bled into what ended up being the final product, Dragon Age the Veilguard, the single player experience. And that limited time frame that they had to finish the game also limited the kinds of stories that they could tell. Now, Dragon Age the Veilguard was eventually delayed by a couple of months, but because the presumption was that they needed to release it in a year and a half and they wouldn't have that delay, they had to use the tone that they had already established for the multiplayer game. They had to use the gameplay choices and the design choices and the tone choices for the multiplayer game to create the single player game. And then when the delay was announced, the developers were like, oh, if we knew beforehand that we had more leeway to be able to like reshape this from the ground up, then we would have done so. But because the delay happened after they had decided to essentially inherit a lot of the multiplayer Dragon Age stuff to be able to finish this game on time, they couldn't change those choices. It was too late. They had to stick to those old choices. And while Dragon Age the Veilguard was going through development, leadership turnaround was just constant. They kept getting new leaders, and so there wasn't really a strong vision. Eventually, they did manage to make an alpha build for the game at the end of 2022, and playtesters all said the same thing, which was it doesn't feel like players really have much agency in the narrative. When they make choices, it doesn't feel like those choices trickle down to any narrative developments. It feels like you're kind of railroaded into one narrative track. And that has a lot to do with the fact that so much of Veilguard was built upon the foundation of the once live service game, a type of genre that limits player choice and narrative consequences because it's a bunch of players partaking in the world. And so, different players can't make different choices that lead to different narrative developments because everyone's inhabiting the same world. So they have to railroad players into specific choices. That was what carried over from the multiplayer Dragon Age game. That's why single player Veilguard, because it inherited so much of that, felt so lacking in those actions and consequences elements that Bioware is so known for. Then in 2023, to help finish Dragon Age: The Veilguard, Bioware decided to bring members of those who were working on the next Mass Effect game into the development of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. And there was just a lot of internal turmoil there where the Mass Effect folks felt like the Dragon Age folks didn't do a good job. The Mass Effect folks began to kind of take over and exclude the Dragon Age leadership from like important meetings and stuff like that. Now, the best part about Dragon Age: The Veilguard, many people cite, is the finale. And apparently, the Mass Effect team who came in to help finish the game are responsible for that emotional finale. They also helped overhaul certain aspects of the game and add additional scenes, and it would seem as though there is an agreement that the Mass Effect team did make Dragon Age: The Veilguard better, even if there was that turmoil between the Mass Effect folks and the Dragon Age folks. And something that the Mass Effect folks, the Mass Effect leadership noted when they first play tested Dragon Age: The Veilguard was the tone of the game and how snarky it felt. You know, it had that like Marvel dialogue kind of a vibe to it that made them think that Dragon Age: The Veilguard could face the same issue as something like Forspoken, whose dialogue was all very like jokey and like nobody took anything seriously. And Dragon Age: The Veilguard did retain some of that, but there are also some of the more serious moments, and that's something that apparently the Mass Effect team are more responsible for, or, you know, they pushed for an implementation of more of that. And that's where you get that tonal dissonance, where sometimes you get Marvel levels of snarky dialogue, and then other times the game actually feels like it's taking itself seriously, but it never feels like the tone is consistent. And the tonal inconsistency was a big part of why Dragon Age: The Veilguard was so lambasted by fans. They felt like it all just felt very disjointed on that front. And then to make matters worse, morale at Bioware was negatively impacted by mass layoffs that happened during Dragon Age: The Veilguard's development, alongside the fact that overtime work was being mandated. And around that time, writer's strike was happening, and so they were more limited in their ability to change or add dialogue and scenes and whatnot. And so yeah, they just had to ship something, and what came out was ultimately the culmination of a lack of a cohesive development cycle, with the game having changed directions multiple times, with new leadership coming in constantly, with stuff from a multiplayer game having to be carried over to be able to finish this game on time instead of being able to make the single player game from scratch. And that's why a lot of the tonal choices, gameplay choices, design choices, and the writing issues and all these things, the tonal dissonance, this is why all of that stuff ultimately ended up being in Dragon Age: The Veilguard. They just had to work with what they had with the very limited time that they were given. And so again, the fact that under these circumstances, the developers were able to ship a product that was functional and that was actually among BioWare's most polished releases goes to highlight that there is great talent at the studio, but the constant corporate and leadership and management issues and how they keep tripping over the entire studio, how they keep shooting the studio in the foot, and how their methodologies and interferences and mandates just get in the way of allowing the developers to cook and realize the full potential of what they're working on is just incredibly frustrating and infuriating. Because if they can ship a product like Dragon Age: The Veilguard, which was the best version of what this could have been under the circumstances, if they can ship that, then imagine what they can actually ship with the right environment, with the right leadership, and without the level of interference that causes, you know, shifts in direction from single player to multiplayer live service back to single player, and then a limited time frame to transform the multiplayer game into single player that causes a lot of just stuff from the multiplayer stuff to bleed into the single player, which diminishes the single player experience because, you know, you're using the foundations of a live service game to make the single player game, limiting what you can do with that single player game. Imagine if all of that didn't happen and they were given the best environment to actually cook. I think they would have done much better, and they would have actually created a Dragon Age game that is appropriate for the IP. Now, the fact that the Mass Effect team was responsible for things like that emotional finale that a lot of people do praise about the game, and that they made some positive changes to the game, gives me some optimism that if this team is allowed to cook on the next Mass Effect game, that maybe they'll be able to execute on a game that lives up to the Mass Effect legacy, that lives up to that original trilogy that is so beloved. But it's hard to say for sure. It's hard to know how EA will interfere with this, how leadership will mismanage things, and how the layoffs and the kind of the gutting of this studio will impact the team's ability to execute. But as far as Dragon Age: The Veilguard is concerned, this is kind of everything you need to know, and I feel like suddenly So many confusing aspects of why Dragon Age the Veilguard came out the way it did makes a whole lot of sense. And I feel for the devs who had to go through this bullshit. Or at the very least, that's one man's take. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole expose revealing what happened with Dragon Age the Veilguard. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.